Got it. A couple of days ago, I had a good chat with Barbara Edmonds, the Labor finance spokesperson, about Labor's first real election policy, the Future Fund. And the interview with Barbara is on after this little introduction from me. It seems like a good idea, and obviously it's in tune with some of the things that have already been done here and done overseas. Now, the most obvious example is Temasek, the Singaporean sovereign wealth fund, which has grown dramatically and invested enormous amounts overseas and in Singapore in infrastructure and other assets, and is generally seen as a big success. Then you've got the New Zealand Sovereign Wealth Fund, the New Zealand Super Fund, which is now worth over $80 billion. And you've also got many more of these sovereign wealth funds elsewhere in the world. In fact, there's one in Australia as well. And it seems like a good idea because the government would only have to put in $200 million in seed funding and then put state assets into the fund to be managed by an arm's length manager, someone connected to the guardians of the New Zealand Super Fund. So essentially managers from the New Zealand Super Fund. All good. However, in my view, this risks extending the magical thinking that both National and Labor have, that the infrastructure needed to deal with very fast population growth and ageing populations can be built with private funding and done quickly with the little bit of help here and there, but not too much, from the government itself in the form of these future funds. The problem here, of course, is that the scale of this is not nearly enough to deal with the growth in our population and the need for infrastructure. And remember, we're talking around $30 billion a year that is necessary over the next 5 to 10 years if we're going to both catch up and continue to maintain and deal with population and ageing growth. And the cost of it will be significantly higher simply because it is done at arm's length in a non-Crown vehicle, and also risks being out of the control of politicians. Now, we've seen this with the New Zealand Super Fund, where the government borrowed money, put it into the fund, and it promptly went overseas to invest in Nvidia and Apple and the likes. Nearly 90% of the New Zealand Super Fund and the $160 billion in the KiwiSaver funds is overseas. And part of the reason for this future fund is to try and pull this back and invest in local assets. I think it's also a distraction for the Labor Party, who really should be dealing with the fundamental issues here, which are to change the incentives in our economy, which currently incentivise leveraged investment in residential land. Now, I asked Barbara if this was instead of changing those incentives, and what I'm talking about here is a capital gains tax, a proper comprehensive one, not just a little one on homes beyond the family home, and also the need to change the incentives for investing in pension funds. Currently, New Zealand is one of the few places in the world where we don't have a capital gains tax and we don't have incentives for investing in pension funds. That uneven playing field has left us with a housing market worth $1.6 trillion, which is worth 7 times the value of our entire stock market. That compares with Australia, which has a housing market worth about 4 times its stock market. And it compares with the United States, where the housing market there is worth only about 1 times the value of the US stock market. So we are a housing market with bits tacked on, and this future fund doesn't really change it. It is performative politics that extends the magical thinking that we can achieve what we want in terms of public services and infrastructure without having to pay for it. I'm Bernard Hickey. And that is a bit of an intro before this interview now with Barbara Edmonds. Apologies, it's taken a while to get up. We had a few problems with Amazon Web Services. Ka kite anō. And thanks again to Barbara for the time to explain this future fund. Barbara, could you tell us what you've announced?
Yeah, kia ora, Bernard. Thank you for the opportunity. Today we announced that Labor's first party policy is the Future Fund. For us, it's the first step to realising New Zealand's potential, a future made here in New Zealand. So effectively it is a sovereign wealth fund that's been set up that will be seeded by commercial government assets what those assets are, we will confirm them in government because of commercial sensitivities and market disclosures that are associated with some of them. But ultimately, the fund is purpose-built to back Kiwi ideas and our small innovative businesses, and basically is here to create wealth for New Zealand, by New Zealand, for New Zealanders.
Yeah, so what's the problem you think you're trying to solve here?
Yeah, so when we look across the world, future funds are set up to help countries recycle their wealth and help to back and grow within their own economies. New Zealand doesn't lack talent and skills and ideas, but what we do lack is backing. So one of the key things that the Productivity Commission talked about before it was collapsed by this current government is that we have shallow pools of capital. So it's about, the government saying, look, we want to set up this wealth fund at arm's length to the government, similar to how the super fund works, but actually it has a different purpose, which is to create wealth in New Zealand to help secure jobs, transition to clean green energy, to help us back our innovators in tech industry, and to help us build a resilient infrastructure.
But is that true, that we have shallow capital pools? Because actually there's over $200 billion in term deposit and savings accounts in the banks. And there is over $125 billion in KiwiSaver funds, not to mention 60 plus billion in the New Zealand Super Fund and not much less in the ACC funds. And those are independent of other pension funds that are around in New Zealand. So upwards, you're looking at a good $500 billion in New Zealand accounts owned by New Zealanders that could be deployed in New Zealand assets. Why can't that money be deployed into New Zealand real assets and real jobs and investments?
So there are different funds around, and for example, iwi are looking at establishing their own Indigenous investment fund. Ultimately, there are different funds for different purposes, and what we're saying is this wealth fund is solely dedicated to reinvesting back in New Zealand. The super fund, for example, they invest around 11 to 18% of the funds in New Zealand. However, they've got a very different purpose. Their purpose is to maximise returns to help with future superannuation costs. We're saying it's a model that works well for the super fund. However, for the future fund, we need a different pool with a different purpose to back Kiwis.
Now, is this instead of changing the fundamental incentives in our economy, which have led us down this track where New Zealand households have put $1.6 trillion into the housing market, and the stock market is only worth about 200 billion. So we're talking, less than an eighth of the size of our housing market. And if you look at the comparative sizes of housing markets and stock markets overseas, we are vastly less invested in our businesses, let alone our public and private infrastructure than elsewhere. And the large reason for that is there's a massive tax break for people to put their money into their own houses or multiple houses. And it's not just a tax break in that they don't pay capital gains tax, but they also can get leverage, and you can't so easily into other types of assets. And the argument put forward by the IMF and the OECD and the likes has always been change the fundamental tax incentives for savings so that households are more likely to put their money into a pension fund or some sort of actual business through either pension incentives and also taxing some of that wealth that is made tax-free in residential land. Is this instead of changing the incentives?
So we will have a savings and investment policy, which we will announce in the future. However, this is just the first step to realise New Zealand's potential. And again, it's about backing Kiwi and making sure, for me in particular and for others in our community, or if they go away and see the world, we want to make sure there are opportunities for them to come back to. That pull back to New Zealand is diminishing. We're having 200 people leaving every day to find opportunities offshore. Labour, as we go up and down the country, people are saying we want to see a long-term vision. We want to see a plan for the country. So this is a first step for us.
So this fund, can you give us an idea of, how big it can be, where the money might come from, and what sort of assets? I know you can't say exactly which Crown-owned assets could go in there, but I'm guessing there's a few publicly listed and non-publicly listed commercial assets out there, plus, and they would be able to, in theory, retain their dividends. So what are we talking about in terms of size and the types of, assets?
So top of the list of the types of assets we will see the fund with will be a lot of those publicly owned commercial assets that the government owns. We also set aside $200 million one-off capital costs to go into the fund. And again, the governance of this will be at arm's length to the politicians, because it'll be looked after by the guardians of the future fund, so it's the New Zealand Super Fund. And ultimately, it's around reinvesting that money back into our country to help create jobs and back business. So the growth of the fund itself, we obviously do want it to grow. And, it will grow every year, depending on the assets that are put in, the dividends that come back to it. But also, we want to be able to use those dividends better. Currently, at the moment, those dividends come back to the Crown coffers. Ministers can spray that wherever they want to. There may not be any strategic, use of it. Or, for example, they may be trying to go into clean energy, but then they're doing an underwrite for gas subsidies. Whereas this is different. This is saying that those dividends should remain in the fund, be reinvested into the country, and depending on what the assets are, that'll determine the growth, as well as where the guardians decide to invest that.
So there's a couple of choices here about how you increase investment, particularly from the government or directed by the government, into the economy, be it infrastructure or private business or government-owned businesses. You can literally borrow money on the Crown's balance sheet and invest it. And that's by far the cheapest way to do this. You probably do that for the $200 million seed capital. But why increase your costs, if you like, by having that fund borrow money and also get returns from government-owned investments, which imply capital costs way higher than the 4 or 5% that you might have to pay if it was just plain old vanilla government bonds?
Because at the moment the politicians are spending or are fiddling around too much with that. Ultimately, we have government assets. We believe that they should be managed a bit more of a commercial approach. The dividends should be reinvested in New Zealand. Ultimately, where the fund will go will be set out in legislation. We want it to be reinvested back for the public good. So the money will be reinvested. Yes, the Crown may lose money because we may forego some dividend in relation to it. However, ultimately, the money is staying back in our economy so that it can grow New Zealand, as opposed to us having to wait for foreign investors and speculators to come and save us. So we truly believe, for us, this is about a future made in New Zealand. It's one we want to make opportunities for Kiwis of the next generation to want to come to stay here or come back here, because there are opportunities for them.